Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Learning with Jelly. Today, we're on lesson 2 on our Python for Beginners series, and we are going to start to talk about lists. Now, in lesson 1, we went over numbers and strings, and we're just going through each of the variable types and important fundamentals about these variable types so that we can utilize them in more complex problems down the road. So, today we're going to go into lists, and that's going to be our first collection. So, the first thing that we want to learn is the syntax of lists. Lists are normally denoted by square brackets. Actually, not normally, they're always denoted by square brackets. Items in a list are separated by commas, and items in that list can be any variable type. They can be numbers, strings, booleans, which is true or false, and they can be lists. So you can have lists of lists. And of course, that gets a little bit complicated, but there may be a lot of use cases where you want to make a list of lists. So just like strings, we can index lists. And what indexing is that we pull out an item of that list. So in the example below, you can see that we initialize a list with 3 items in there. James Bond as a string, 55 as an integer, and 123 Main Street as another string. And say, for instance, we want to access the second item of that list. Remember that Python starts counting from 0. So James Bond would be 0, 55 would be 1, and Main Street would be 2. So you would call list, which is the variable name, in square brackets, you would say 2, and that would return the 2 element within that list. If we start at 0, in the below example, we have 2 lists within one list. So we see a square bracket, and then we see 2 lists with their individual square brackets surrounding them. So James Bond and 55 is in the first list, Jill Bond and 52 is in the second list. So if we were to index this list and have 1 would be the list that we're pointing to. So the James Bond list is the 0th list, and the Jill Bond is the first. And then within that first list, I want the first element. So if Jill Bond is the 0th element of the first list, 52 would be the first element of the first list. So we would return 52. So this is how we would index lists. It takes some getting used to. Just remember that you always start counting at 0. And when you want to index list of list, it's good to kind of think through that process. Okay, so outside of indexing lists, there are common methods, okay? Inserting, you can insert an element into a list. You can append more than one list together or concatenate more than one list together. You can remove items from a list by using the dot remove and dot pop. So there's so many methods for lists. I highly encourage you to look up the documentation for those methods. But in these 2 examples, we have how you can concatenate lists. Okay. So in our first example, we have 2 lists, list 1 and list 2. And if I just call print list 1 plus list 2, it's just going to concatenate these lists. It's going to put both of these lists into one list. So now we see that it returns a list with 4 items in it. If I also call list 1 dot append Bob in my second example, and I type list 1 so it can print out, I see now at that list I have Alan, Sue, and Bob. So the dot append is just going to append certain items to a list, which is going to be very useful for us when we go through for loops momentarily. So once again, look up all the methods you can do with lists. You can do tons of different things with lists. So now we're going to get into list comprehensions, which takes a minute for most students to comprehend. So we're going to go through multiple examples of this. Feel free to pause the video, open up a blank Jupyter notebook so that you can try list comprehensions on your own. We're going to have tons of examples that we're going through. So you can generate a new list of items from existing iterables. And what an iterable is just a fancy word for another list. anything that you can iterate through, okay, that has more than one item pretty much. The syntax is going to be these square brackets. Then you're going to put your function. And then after the function, you're going to have this keyword for X in iterable. And let me change this to a different color so it stands out for us. So pretty much we're going to have a function. That function could be exponentiating, dividing, concatenating, whatever that function may be. And we're going to say for each item in the existing list, do this function. You can also add on this if condition, which the if condition is optional. But say, for instance, you only want to do this function for certain elements in the list, then you would do this if condition. So keep in mind that list comprehensions are still surrounded by those brackets. That's how you know it's a list in Python, if it has brackets surrounding it. X can be any letter or word. I like to make X very descriptive based off of what is in my list. So that could be P, Q, number, pizza, whatever you want it to be. It does not have to be X. The condition, which is the blue portion here, is optional. And the iterable is just a collection. So you're actually going to go one by one through this collection. And then you want to create these piece by piece and practice, practice, practice. So, for instance, in my example below, I have this list of odds, right? And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items in this list. So now I want to turn all of these odd numbers into even numbers. So I'm going to call a new variable even numbers, and I'm going to set that equal to nums plus 1. So it's going to add plus 1 to each of these numbers in this list. And then the for keyword is going to be for nums in odds. So odds is the iterable, which is the list that I initialize up at top. So this nums and this nums are going to be the same thing. Okay. So I'm going to say for each number in my odds list, the function I want you to do is add 1 to each one of those numbers. And then when I print out even numbers, I get 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So that is a good example of list comprehensions. It's going to be the function, and then it's going to be for whatever you want this to be. Just make sure it's the same thing that you put in your function in whatever list you've already established before this. Okay? So let's look at more examples. So example 2, on our next slide, we see that we have a list called salutation, okay? And it has these 3 salutations. And now I'm saying upper salutations, which is going to turn all of these salutations into uppercase. So I'm saying letters dot upper, because dot upper with parentheses is a method for strings, okay? And it's going to be nothing in those parentheses for letters in salutation. So notice that letters and letters are the same. And in salutation, salutation is the name of the list that I've already initialized up top. Okay. So I'm saying, hey, go through each item in this list, okay, which I'm calling letters. Okay. You can call this items, you can call it X, whatever you want to call it, and apply this function where I'm able to change all of those letters to uppercase and then give me back that list. Okay. So then we're able to change all of our letters to uppercase in the output. All right, so let's look at another example. Example 3, I have minutes. So I initialize a list. Oops, I moved that over. I initialize a list of minutes. So I have minutes, and then minutes to hours. So the function that I want to do is divide each one of those minutes by 60 for minutes in the list minutes that I established up here. Okay. And once again, notice that minute is the same minute that's in my function. So this is my function piece. This is my iterable, iterate, and iterable, which iterable is my already established list. And then now I see that all of those minutes have turned to hours in my output. Okay. So, those are three examples of list comprehension. I highly recommend that you type these into your Jupyter Notebook or whatever interface you're using for your Python. Also, try to think of other list comprehensions that you can do. Can you change a list of numbers to prime numbers? Can you exponentiate or square each number in a list? So just start off with basic lists full of numbers or strings that you can apply functions to. So our next list comprehension example is going to be with a condition. And so here I have a list of integers, both negative and positive, and I want to take the absolute value of each number in that list if the number is less than 0. So here I only want to pull out my negative numbers, which is -10, -8, -2. And I'm saying, hey, take the absolute value of those negative numbers for num in integers. Integers, once again, is the list that I've already established only if that number is less than 0. So then I get out those once negative numbers that are now positive. Okay. So that's how you can use this optional conditional that we had in our syntax for list comprehension if necessary. If you only want to perform a function for certain items within that list. Okay, so now that we've seen multiple examples of list comprehension, for those who went through list comprehension, you say, wait, I know a little bit about for loops. Why can't we just do this with a for loop? For number one, sometimes list comprehensions are more efficient than for loops. And some people use list comprehensions in their code. So you have to be able to read someone else's code. There's a lot of times in the workplace where you have to read code, get feedback on other people's code. So it's good to know when you encounter a list comprehension. However, when you're starting off to code with Python, use with method you are comfortable with. Okay, just know both, but use which one you're comfortable with, if that makes sense. So, if you're more comfortable with for loops, by all means, use for loops. If you're more comfortable with list comprehensions, go that way. Okay. So, in the first example that we went over, notice that for our list comprehension, which is this first block of code, this is what the list comprehension was. We added 1 to every number for nums and odds. So, if you wanted to do this in the for loop, the first thing that you would do is initialize an empty list that has a different name than from the list that you are going to iterate through or loop through. So these two lists right here should have different names. And then once again, you're going to say for num and odds. So this portion of the list comprehension and this portion is the same. And you're going to call this new list that you initialize, and you're going to say dot append because we can append items to a list and add 1 to each number. So within that dot append is going to be that function inside that parentheses that we are looking for. And then we're going to return that list. Okay. So both of these are the same. You pick your poison, but you still need to know how to read list comprehensions. Just know that the function comes first and then that for loop piece comes next. So if you're using for loops, list comprehension shouldn't be that tough to grasp. So let's look at that again in some more examples of how we can use for loops. So the steps, and I just outlined this from the previous slide. The first thing that you want to do when you're doing a for loop is to initialize an empty list. So just empty square brackets. Okay. Then you want to call for num and odds, append to this empty list whatever function you want to do to each item in that list goes in the parentheses, and then you're going to just type out that new list name, and that is going to return your output. So both of these are the same thing. So let's look at another example. So our salutation example, Once again, we had our function letters.upper, which is going to go through each item in this list and turn it into uppercase. Okay. So for a for loop, we're going to call a new named empty list. So once again, this list has to be a different name than the one up here. And we're going to say for each item, which we're calling letters, the item, and salutation, append to our new list the uppercase method that we can utilize for strings, and then we type out our list and we give the same thing. So notice the parentheses here, okay? It has to have that syntax. If you get any errors while you're practicing it, most of the time it's an indentation error because Python needs to be indented properly. Capitalization matters, parentheses, brackets, all that good stuff matters. So make sure that you read those errors and you have it formatted properly. Okay, so that was our second example of list comprehensions versus for loops. Let's look at our third example. So we had our minutes to hours, and for each minute that was in our list, we divided it by 60 to get the hours for minute in minutes. Okay, so now for the for loop, we create a new list. In this case, I'm calling it hours. I'm calling it different from what's up here. And I'm saying, hey, for each minute that's in my list of minutes, append this function, and then I type back hours so it can print in my output. Okay. So very, very, very similar syntax, multiple examples. All right, let's go through example 4. So this was our absolute value with condition, okay? So now our for loop is going to be expanded to have a condition within it, okay? So here I call a new list for my for loop called negatives, and then I say for num in integers, so it's going to look into this list of integers, and for every number, if the number is less than 0, append the absolute value of that number to my empty list. And then when I type my empty list name, I get 1082. Now, what if we wanted to return the entire list? So I just want to change all of these numbers to positive. I would have to add a else statement in my for loop. So once again, we have an empty list, and I'm going to say, hey, for numbers in those integers, if the number is less than 0, take the absolute value of that number and put it in my empty list. Else, just append the number as is. Okay. So then when I type in negs, it's going to give me all my numbers outputted, except for all of my numbers are going to be positive now. Okay. So that was all of our examples of list comprehension versus for loops. So, like I said, lists are a collection of items. They're surrounded by square brackets. You can add things to lists, remove things to lists, iterate through lists. List comprehension is a very common way to apply a function to each item within your list. Okay. Outside of list comprehensions, you can also use for loops. So try to think of list comprehensions that you can do on your own. That's simple. Like I said, square rooting numbers, turning letters to lowercase, splitting two words within a string, and try to practice list comprehension and do the for loop that corresponds to that list comprehension. So thank you for tuning in with Learning with Jelly. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you have any questions. And I look forward to you on lesson 3 while we go through tuples. Thank you and have a great day.